For 30 years, I never flew at night. Not once. I had no reason to. Then they built a wedding venue beside my airstrip, filed noise complaints against me, got the HOA involved, pressured my flight students to leave, nearly destroyed everything my father and grandfather built on this land. So the night flights returned, not out of spite, not to cause trouble, because they left me no choice. My name is Jake Mercer. I own a private airstrip that has been in my family for over 40 years. And what I am about to tell you is the story of how a luxury wedding venue moved in next door, tried to erase 40 years of legal flight operations, and made the single biggest mistake they could have made. They assumed I would just give up. They built beside my runway knowing exactly what it was. So why were they acting like the airport suddenly appeared out of nowhere? My name is Jake Mercer. I am a retired commercial pilot. 31 years in the air regional carriers, cargo runs, a brief stint instructing at a flight academy in Ohio. When my father passed, I came home. The airstrip had been in my family since before I was born. My grandfather cleared the land himself. My father poured the first section of runway with 2 hired hands and a borrowed concrete mixer. By the time I was old enough to understand what I was looking at, it was already a working strip, local pilots landing on weekends, my father giving informal lessons to anyone willing to learn. I did not come back to make money off it. I came back because leaving it empty felt wrong. So I kept it running, maintained the surface, renewed the permits, taught lessons when people asked. It gave me something to do. It kept the place alive. The land next door sat vacant for years. Then it sold. Developers broke ground on a luxury wedding venue, manicured lawns, a white pavilion, the whole picture. I did not think much of it. People build things. That is fine. The first warning sign came about 3 months before they opened. The venue manager knocked on my door and asked, very politely, whether I would be willing to avoid flying during their events. I told him no. Politely. But no. The venue opened on a Thursday in late April. I remember because I had 2 students scheduled that week, a Saturday morning lesson and a Tuesday afternoon session. I kept both. Nobody said anything. The first few weekends passed without incident. Weddings happened next door, planes went up and came down on my side of the property line, and the world kept turning. I thought maybe the manager had accepted my answer and moved on. He had not. About 6 weeks after opening, I was doing a routine pre-flight check on a Friday afternoon when a black SUV pulled up to the edge of my property. The man who stepped out was not the manager. He was older, better dressed, and he walked across the grass like he owned everything he stepped on. I found out later his name was Richard Colt. He was the primary investor behind the venue and the face of the ownership group. He introduced himself, shook my hand, smiled. Then he told me the aircraft were becoming a serious problem. I listened. I let him finish. He talked about his clients, couples spending $40,000, $50,000 on a single day. He talked about the noise disrupting ceremonies. He talked about the complaints he was fielding from event planners who were threatening to take their bookings elsewhere. He was calm about it, reasonable sounding, the kind of calm that has been rehearsed. When he finished, I asked him one question. I asked him how long he thought the airstrip had been here. He said he understood it had been here a while. I told him it had been here for over 40 years. I told him my grandfather cleared this land before most of the roads in this county existed. I told him the runway was on every regional aviation chart, registered with the FAA, and fully permitted by the county. I told him that when his development group purchased that property, this airstrip was not a secret. It was a fact of the land. He nodded through all of it, kept the smile going. Then he said what people like him always say when they do not want to hear the truth, that he understood my position, but surely there was room for compromise. Maybe I could limit operations to certain hours. Maybe I could notify the venue in advance before scheduling lessons. Maybe we could find some arrangement that worked for everyone. I told him the airstrip operated on its own schedule, the same way it always had, and that I was not going to restructure 40 years of operations around his event calendar. The smile did not move. But something behind it did. He said he would hoped we could handle this between ourselves. Then he got back in the SUV and left. 10 days later, I got a letter from the HOA. I want to be clear about something. I had been part of this HOA for years, paid my dues, attended the occasional meeting, never had a single issue with them. The board was made up of people I recognized. Some I would known casually for a long time. So when that letter arrived citing my flight operations as a community nuisance, I read it 3 times because I was sure I was misunderstanding something. I was not. The letter referenced noise complaints from multiple residents, cited an ordinance I had never seen enforced in 4 decades of operating this strip. It requested that I voluntarily suspend flight training activities pending a board review. I called the HOA office and asked for the names of the residents who had complained. They told me that information was confidential. I asked when this ordinance had last been applied to any property in the community. They said they could not discuss specifics over the phone. I asked when the board review would be scheduled. They said they would be in touch. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while. Something about the timing bothered me more than the letter itself. Richard Colt visits on a Friday. Calm, rehearsed, reasonable. 10 days later, the HOA sends an official notice. I had not received a single complaint from any neighbor in 40 years. Not one. And now, within 2 weeks of Colt's visit, I had a formal warning letter from the board citing multiple residents. I started paying closer attention. The next Saturday, there was a wedding next door. I had a student scheduled, a young woman named Carla who had been working toward her private certificate for about 4 months. We went up, ran through our lesson, landed clean. Straightforward morning. By Sunday evening, I had 2 new noise complaints in my email from the HOA. The Saturday after that, same thing. Wedding next door, lesson on my end. 2 more complaints by the following day. I pulled up the HOA complaint portal and looked at the submission timestamps. Every single complaint had been filed within hours of a flight on a weekend. Not during the week. Not on days without events next door. Only on wedding days. I did not have names yet. But I had a pattern. That same week, I ran into one of my longtime neighbors, a man named Gerald who had lived about a quarter mile down the road for as long as I could remember. I asked him straight out if the flights had ever bothered him. He looked at me like I would ask him something strange. "Jake," he said, "I have been listening to those planes my whole life. Would not know what quiet sounds like without them." He had not filed anything. Did not know anyone who had. I drove home thinking about that. A few days later, I got a second letter from the HOA. Stronger language this time. It referenced the possibility of escalating the matter if operations continued unchanged. At the bottom of the letter, someone had added a handwritten note. It was not signed. It just said, "One way or another, those planes are going to stop. I am not someone who panics easily. 31 years in commercial aviation will do that to you. You learn to separate real problems from noise." But what was happening here did not feel like noise anymore. It felt organized. So I treated it the way I would treat any problem with an unknown source. I started documenting everything. Every complaint that came through the HOA portal. I logged date, time, stated reason, and the timestamp relative to any flight activity that day. I requested copies of the original complaint submissions through a formal written request to the board. It took them 2 weeks to respond, and when they did, the names and contact details had been redacted. What they could not redact were the email domains. 11 of the first 14 complaints had been submitted from email addresses connected to the venue addresses ending in the same domain as the wedding venue's staff communications. I cross-referenced them against the venue's public-facing contact page. 3 of the addresses matched staff listings directly. The others were variations of the same domain, different names, same route. My actual neighbors, people who had lived beside this airstrip for 10, 15, 20 years, had filed 0 complaints. Not one. I sat with that for a day. Then I called my attorney. His name was Paul Denton. Aviation law, property rights, some land use work on the side. I would used him twice before for minor permit renewals, and never needed him for anything serious. I laid out everything I had, the Colt visit, the HOA letters, the complaint pattern, the email domains. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Keep logging everything. Do not change your operations. Do not reduce flights. Do not adjust your schedule. Do not make any voluntary concessions. The moment you do, it looks like an admission." I told him I had no intention of changing anything. He said, "Good, because if this is what it looks like, they are going to need you to blink first." I did not blink. What happened instead was the HOA found a new approach. The informal noise complaints were not getting traction, probably because even they knew the complaint sources would not hold up under scrutiny. So the board shifted to regulatory language. Over the next 6 weeks, I received 4 separate notices, each one citing a different municipal or HOA code provision. One referenced a setback ordinance that applied to structures. not aircraft operations. One cited a decibel limit that had been written for stationary industrial equipment. One referenced a community aesthetics clause. I still do not know how they thought that applied to an airplane. Each letter was written carefully. Formal language, specific code numbers, signature from the board secretary. Someone had done research, or paid someone to do it. Meanwhile, the venue started adjusting its event schedule. This one took me a few weeks to notice. I kept a personal log of my flight activity dates, times, duration, because I had been doing it for years as a habit. When I compared my log against the venue's published event calendar, the pattern was hard to miss. They had started booking their largest events, the ones with the most guests. The most expensive packages, specifically during the hours I typically flew on weekends. Peak lesson times. Peak local pilot traffic. Every takeoff now had an audience of wedding guests. Every landing generated fresh complaints. I do not know if Colt engineered that deliberately or if someone on his staff suggested it, but the effect was the same. Each flight became an incident. Each incident became documentation. The documentation fed the HOA process. The HOA process fed the legal threat that was clearly being built in the background. Then the social media started. Someone created a post in the main local community group, the kind of Facebook group every small county has, mostly used for lost dog announcements and road closure warnings. The post did not name me directly. It talked about ongoing aircraft disturbances near a residential and event area. It used words like dangerous and unregulated. It asked whether the county had any oversight of private airstrips. The post got shared. Then another appeared. Then someone created a separate page, Safe Skies Coalition, which sounded official enough that a few people probably assumed it was a real organization. The page posted photos of small aircraft with captions about low-altitude risks. None of the photos were taken at my airstrip. None of the claims were sourced. I am not naive enough to think I can prove who was behind those pages, but I know how to look at timing. The first post appeared 48 hours after the HOA sent its third warning letter. The Safe Skies Coalition page launched the same week Colt's attorneys made their first contact with Paul Denton. The community group posts did damage. Not legally, but socially. People who did not know anything about aviation started leaving comments. Someone said their child was frightened by low-flying planes. Someone else said they would seen an aircraft nearly clip the tree line. Neither of those things had happened. But once something is written in a comments section, it becomes real enough for some people. Flight students started calling to reschedule, then to cancel. Carla, the student who had been 4 months into her private certificate work, left me a voicemail saying she had decided to put lessons on hold. She did not explain why, but she did not need to. I would seen the community group posts. Her name had appeared in the comments on one of them. Another student canceled the following week. Then a local pilot who had been using the strip for weekend flights stopped showing up. Revenue dropped. Not catastrophically, not yet, but enough that I felt it. The airstrip had never been a major income source, but the lesson fees covered maintenance costs and kept the operation self-sustaining. Losing students meant dipping into personal savings to keep the runway in condition. My daughter called one evening. She had seen some of the social media posts. She was worried not just about the finances, but about the story being built around me. She said, "Dad, people who do not know you are going to read that stuff and think it is true." She was right. That was exactly the point. My brother drove out the following Saturday. Walked the property with me. Looked at the runway. Looked at the venue next door. He did not say much for a while. Then he said maybe it was worth talking to Colt again. Finding some middle ground before things got worse. I understood why he said it. He was scared for me. But I also knew that middle ground was not what Colt was after. He did not want compromise. He wanted the airstrip gone. Everything that had happened in the last 2 months made that clear. I told my brother I was not going anywhere. That same week, on a Tuesday morning, 2 county officials showed up at the property unannounced. They had clipboards and a complaint reference number. Someone had filed a formal report with the county alleging unsafe aircraft operations at my address. The complaint was anonymous. They walked the strip, checked my permit documentation, looked at the runway surface. One of them had clearly done this before. He moved through the inspection with the kind of efficiency that meant he was not expecting to find anything. The other one was newer, quieter, kept glancing toward the venue next door. At the end of the inspection, the senior official told me everything appeared to be in compliance. I thanked him and watched them drive away. Then I went inside and called Paul Denton. Something had shifted in me that morning. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity. I was done waiting to see what they would try next. If they were going to keep coming, I needed to understand the full picture of what I was dealing with. And the only way to do that was to go back to the beginning, back to before the venue ever broke ground. I asked Paul to help me pull the original development records. The letter from Colt's attorneys arrived on a Wednesday morning. It was 11 pages long. I know because I counted them at the kitchen table before I called Paul. The language was dense, full of phrases like unreasonable interference with lawful business operations and actionable nuisance under applicable state statute. There were citations to case law I would never heard of. There were references to noise studies that did not exist yet but which the letter implied were forthcoming. The core demand was straightforward underneath all the legal dressing. Restrict flight operations to specific hours. Eliminate all training activity during weekend afternoons. And submit a monthly schedule to the venue for advance review. That last part is the one that stayed with me. Submit my flight schedule to Richard Colt for advance review. On my own property. On a runway my family had operated for over 40 years. I faxed the letter to Paul that afternoon. He called me back within the hour. He said, "They are not filing anything yet. This is pressure. They want you to respond with a counteroffer, something they can use to establish that you acknowledged the conflict and were willing to negotiate terms." I asked him what he recommended. He said, "Nothing. We do not respond to this letter at all." That felt uncomfortable. Ignoring an 11-page legal threat is not a natural instinct. But Paul explained it clearly. Any response that engaged with their framing, even to reject it, validated the premise that my operations required justification. Silence at this stage was the correct answer. So I said nothing. 2 weeks later, the HOA held an emergency session. I was not invited. I found out about it afterward through Gerald, my neighbor down the road, who had heard about it from someone on the board. The meeting had been called specifically to address what the agenda described as ongoing aircraft safety concerns affecting community welfare. Colt had attended. 2 of his staff members had attended. 3 of the board members had met privately with Colt's representatives the week before the session. The board voted 4-1 to pursue formal operational restrictions on the airstrip through whatever regulatory channels were available. The one dissenting vote was a woman named Barbara Tilson, who had been on the board for 6 years. She called me the morning after the meeting. She said she did not think what was happening was right, and she wanted me to know she had not supported it. She also told me something I had not known, that 2 of the board members who voted yes had attended the venue's opening event as guests of Colt's ownership group. They would been wined and dined the night before they were supposed to be impartial community representatives. I wrote that down. The public safety narrative started accelerating around the same time. Colt's team was clearly working 2 tracks simultaneously, the legal pressure through attorneys and the community pressure through story. The story was getting more specific now. It was not just noise anymore. It was safety. A report appeared. I never found out exactly how it circulated, whether it was emailed around or posted somewhere, claiming that a small aircraft had come dangerously close to the venue's outdoor pavilion during a ceremony. The report described guests ducking, a near miss, genuine fear for lives. It never happened. I had my flight logs. I had timestamps. I had a student in the cockpit with me during every lesson flight. None of my logged flights on any of the dates referenced in that report came within the kind of proximity being described. The FAA has specific altitude and proximity regulations for exactly this kind of operation, and I had been following them without exception for 31 years of professional flying. But the report spread anyway. It reached the local paper not as a published story, but as a tip. A reporter called me for comment. I referred her to Paul, who issued a brief statement denying the incident and offering to provide flight logs as documentation. The paper never ran a story, but the damage was already moving through the community in the way these things do, person to person, assumption to assumption. 2 neighbors who had been friendly stopped making eye contact when I drove past. A family that had occasionally brought their kids to watch flights from the fence line stopped coming. The isolation was gradual, and then it was not. 1 week I felt it as a small thing, and the next week it felt like the whole character of the place had changed. My insurance carrier was next. They sent a letter, polite, procedural, informing me that they had received several third-party inquiries regarding operations at my property and were conducting a routine review of my policy. They requested documentation of my permits, my FAA registration, my maintenance records, and a written description of all current operational activities. It was the kind of letter that sounds routine until you realize what it means. If my carrier got spooked enough to raise my premiums or reduce my coverage, the economics of operating the Strip would shift significantly. Paul told me that was likely the intent, not to cancel my coverage, but to create enough administrative friction that I would start calculating whether the fight was worth it. I pulled every document they asked for and sent it within the week. Complete file. Nothing missing. The flight school suspension had already happened by then, not a formal one, but a practical one. With students canceling and the social media environment what it was, I had stopped taking new lesson bookings. The 2 remaining students I had were both on indefinite pause. The Strip was quieter than it had been in years. My daughter came to visit on a weekend in late September. She walked the property with me the way my brother had, but she was quieter about it. At dinner she asked me directly how long I could keep going financially if the lesson revenue stayed at 0. I told her I had some runway. The irony of that phrase was not lost on either of us. Maybe 6 months before I would need to make harder decisions. She asked if I would consider just selling. I did not answer for a moment. Not because I was considering it, but because I wanted to be honest with her about what the question meant. I told her this land was not mine to sell. Not really. My grandfather built something here. My father maintained it and expanded it and taught people to fly off of it for 30 years. I came back because walking away from it felt like erasing them. Selling under pressure felt worse than that. She did not push it. She just nodded. That night I sat in the hangar for a while. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt wrong on a piece of land that had always had engine noise somewhere in the background. I looked at the runway and thought about everything that had happened in the past 4 months and tried to figure out what I was missing. Because something still did not add up. The level of coordination, the attorneys, the HOA, the social media, the insurance inquiry, the anonymous county complaint, it was too much for a venue owner who was simply frustrated about noise. This was not a neighbor dispute that had escalated. This had been structured from somewhere. Someone had planned it. I just did not have the proof yet. The next morning I drove to the county records office and asked for everything they had on the venue's original development application. The county records office kept everything in 2 systems, digital filings from the last decade and physical archives going back further. The venue's development application was recent enough to be fully digital. The clerk printed it for me in 3 separate folders. I carried them to my truck, drove home, and spread everything across the kitchen table. I was not sure what I was looking for. That is the honest answer. Paul had suggested pulling the records, and my instinct told me there was something there, but I did not have a specific target. I just started reading. The first folder was the standard application package: site plans, zoning variance requests, environmental review forms, traffic impact assessments. Nothing unusual. The second folder was correspondence between the development group and the county planning commission during the approval process. A lot of back and forth about parking capacity, drainage, setback distances from the road, normal development friction. The third folder is where I stopped. It contained the internal review documents, the materials the Planning Commission used during their deliberation before granting approval. Tucked behind a drainage variance letter was a single page that had clearly been included by administrative habit rather than intent. It was a summary of a pre-application meeting between Colt's Development Group and the County Planning Office, held about 14 months before the venue opened. The summary listed the attendees. It listed the agenda items. And under a section titled Adjacent Property Considerations, it contained 3 lines that I read 4 times before I was sure I understood them correctly. Applicant acknowledges existing private airstrip operations on adjacent parcel. Applicant has reviewed FAA registration and county permit records for said operations. Applicant accepts proximity conditions as part of development scope. They knew. Before they filed a single permit application, before they broke a single piece of ground, they had reviewed my FAA registration and my county permits. They had formally acknowledged the airstrip's existence and accepted the proximity as a condition of their development. This was not a case of a business owner who got surprised by a neighbor's operations after the fact. This was a development group that bought land beside a registered airstrip with full knowledge of what was there, accepted that condition in writing during the approval process, and then spent the following year trying to eliminate it. I called Paul immediately. He asked me to read him the exact language from the summary. I read it twice. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, that is significant. Keep going through everything." I kept going. The marketing materials were not in the county records. Those I found separately about a week later through a combination of Paul's research and my own. The venue had done a pre-launch investor presentation, The kind of polished deck that gets circulated to potential backers before a hospitality project opens. One of Paul's contacts had attended a regional investment forum where it had been presented, and still had a copy. When Paul emailed it to me, I opened it on my laptop at the kitchen table. The fourth slide had a photograph of the property. Aerial shot, wide angle, golden hour light, and visible in the background, clear enough that you could make out the runway markings, was my airstrip. The caption underneath the photo read, "Situated beside a historic private airfield, offering a uniquely authentic countryside atmosphere." They had used it as a selling point. My airstrip, the one they were now claiming was a dangerous nuisance that needed to be shut down, had been photographed from the air and featured in their investor materials as an amenity, as atmosphere, as something that made the venue more appealing. I sat with that for a long time. There is a particular kind of anger that does not feel like heat. It feels like cold clarity. That is what I felt sitting at that table. Not rage, something quieter and more focused. Everything that had happened over the past several months clicked into place in a way that was almost mechanical. The complaint campaign, the HOA pressure, the legal threats, the safety rumors, none of it was reactive. They had not built a business and then encountered a problem. They had built a business, used the problem as a feature, and then decided the feature needed to disappear once it stopped being convenient. I kept digging. Paul pulled the HOA board meeting minutes going back 18 months, public record, available on request. 3 of the current board members had attended the venue's opening gala. 2 of them had been present at a private dinner Colt hosted for community stakeholders, 6 weeks before the first HO warning letter landed in my mailbox. One board member, the one who had been most aggressive in pushing the operational restriction vote, had a brother-in-law who worked for the same regional development firm that had co-funded the venue. None of that was illegal by itself, but it told a story. The timeline Paul assembled over the following 2 weeks looked like this. Colt's group purchases land with full knowledge of the airstrip. They use the airstrip in marketing materials to attract investors and early bookings. Venue opens. Venue opens. Colt approaches me directly, the rehearsed, reasonable conversation, almost certainly expecting me to negotiate. I do not. Within 10 days, the HOA machinery starts moving. The complaint campaign begins. The legal threats follow. The social media narrative launches. The insurance inquiry appears. Every piece of it had been staged in sequence. And the sequence had started before the venue ever opened, because the pre-application county document showed they had been thinking about the airstrip from the beginning. Paul said it plainly when we reviewed everything together. They planned to eliminate you from the start. The marketing materials prove they knew the airstrip was there. The pre-application document proves they accepted the conditions. Everything that came after was a campaign, not a complaint. I asked him where that left us. He spread the documents across his desk, the county summary, the investor presentation printout, the HOA minutes, the complaint logs, the attorney letters. He looked up and said, "This changes everything." The HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in November. Paul had requested it formally a public session where the board would be required to present its case for operational restrictions and allow affected parties to respond. The board had tried twice to postpone it. Both times Paul cited the HOA's own procedural bylaws and they ran out of reasons to delay. I drove there alone. Paul met me in the parking lot. He had a banker's box under one arm and a leather folder in the other hand. He looked at me and said, "Let them go first. Do not react to anything. Just let them build their case, and then we will take it apart piece by piece." I told him I understood. The room was fuller than I expected. The venue had done its work. I could see wedding clients in the crowd, women I did not recognize who had the look of people who had been told this meeting was important and shown up accordingly. Event planners. A few people I assumed were Colt's staff. The local paper had sent someone with a notepad. Colt himself was seated in the front row. He was wearing a jacket and no tie, the calculated informality of someone who wants to appear reasonable for an audience. He did not look at me when I came in. The board chair opened the session and gave a brief summary of the situation, framing it as a community concern about quality of life and neighborhood safety. Neutral language. But the framing was not neutral. Every word positioned the airstrip as the disruption and the venue as the victim. Then Colt took the floor. He was good. I will give him that. He spoke for about 12 minutes, and he hit every note carefully: the investment he would made in the community, jobs the venue had created, the couples whose most important day had been affected. He talked about a bride who had cried during her ceremony because of aircraft noise. He talked about elderly guests who found the sound distressing. He never raised his voice. He never attacked me personally. He just painted a picture of a reasonable business being damaged by an unreasonable situation. 2 wedding clients spoke after him. One woman described her reception being interrupted 3 times. Another talked about her photographer having to pause during outdoor portraits. They were genuine in what they said. I do not doubt their experiences were frustrating. But frustration is not the same as having a legal right to silence a 40-year operation. An event planner spoke next. She said she had stopped recommending the venue to clients specifically because of the aircraft issue. She said it had cost the venue significant bookings. The board chair thanked each speaker and then asked if the audience had questions before the response portion of the meeting. Several hands went up. Most of the questions were directed at the board about what powers the HOA actually had, about what the proposed restrictions would look like, about the timeline for a decision. Standard procedural questions from people trying to understand what they would walk into. Then a man 2 rows behind me raised his hand and asked whether the airstrip had been there before the venue. The board chair hesitated, said yes, that was her understanding. The man asked why the venue had been built there if the airstrip was a known issue. The board chair said that was a good question and moved on quickly. Paul leaned over and said quietly, "That is our crowd." When the board indicated it was time for the response, Paul stood and introduced himself. He laid out his credentials briefly: aviation law, property rights, land use. Then he stepped aside and nodded at me. I carried my folder to the front of the room. I did not have a prepared speech. I had documents. I set them on the table in front of me, and I talked through them one at a time. The first was the original FAA registration for the airstrip, dated over 40 years ago. I held it up and read the registration number aloud. The second was the county operating permit, renewed consistently, no gaps, current through the present year. I read the issue dates aloud. The third was a stack of flight logs going back 15 years, every recorded operation, every student lesson, every local pilot visit. I set it on the table without comment. Then I picked up the investor presentation. I told the room that the venue had produced this document before opening to attract financial backing for the project. I told them to look at slide 4. I held up a printed enlargement of the aerial photograph, my runway clearly visible in the background, and I read the caption aloud. Situated beside a historic private airfield, offering a uniquely authentic countryside atmosphere. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been. I set that document down and picked up the county pre-application meeting summary. I explained what it was: a record of a meeting between Colt's Development Group and the county planning office, held more than a year before the venue opened. I read the relevant section aloud, slowly. Applicant acknowledges existing private airstrip operations on adjacent parcel. Applicant has reviewed FAA registration and county permit records for said operations. Applicant accepts proximity conditions as part of development scope. I looked up at the room. They knew, I said. Before they filed a permit, before they broke ground, before they sold a single event package. They reviewed my FAA registration, they reviewed my county permits, and they formally accepted the airstrip as a condition of their development. That is documented. That is in the county's own records. The board chair was writing something on her notepad. She did not look up. I turned to the OA complaint logs next, the ones Paul had obtained through the formal records request. I walked through the email domain analysis. 11 of the first 14 complaints submitted to the HOA had originated from venue staff email addresses. I named the domain. I displayed the printout. These are not community complaints, I said. These are venue staff complaints filed through the HOA system to simulate community opposition. Colt shifted in his seat. It was a small movement, but the room was quiet enough that people noticed. The questions that followed were different from the ones before. The man who had asked about the airstrip's age asked another question, this time directed at Colt directly. He wanted to know whether Colt had been aware of the airstrip before purchasing the property. Colt said he had known about it generally, but had not anticipated the level of disruption. Someone near the back said loudly, "Then why did you put it in your brochure?" A few people laughed. Not many, but enough. A woman near the front, one of the wedding clients who had spoken earlier, turned around and looked at Colt. She asked him whether she had been told about the airstrip before booking her event. He said the situation had developed after her booking. She said, "That is not what I asked." The board chair tried to redirect the room. It did not hold. 3 more people asked questions that Colt could not answer cleanly. His responses started repeating themselves. He referenced his attorneys twice in 5 minutes, which is never a reassuring thing to do in a community meeting. Barbara Tilson, the board member who had called me after the restriction vote, raised her hand from her seat at the board table. She said she wanted it on the record that she had opposed the restriction motion from the beginning, and that the documents presented tonight confirmed her concerns about the process. 2 other audience members stood and said they had lived near the airstrip for years and had never filed a complaint and had never been bothered by the flights. Gerald was one of them. By the time the meeting concluded, the board chair looked like she wanted to be somewhere else entirely. She announced that given the information presented, the county had been contacted and would be conducting a formal review of the situation before any HOA action could proceed. It was not a victory. Not yet. But it was the first time in months that the weight of the thing had shifted. In the parking lot afterward, Paul put the banker's box in his trunk and looked over at me. They did not expect the marketing materials, he said. That is what broke the room. I drove home and sat in the hangar for a while. For the first time since this started, the quiet did not feel wrong. The formal hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February. It had taken 3 months to get there, 3 months of procedural filings, document exchanges, deposition notices, and the kind of administrative back and forth that exists specifically to exhaust people who do not have the resources to keep up with it. Colt's legal team had filed 2 motions to delay. Both were denied. The county had completed its review and forwarded its findings to the hearing officer assigned to the case. Paul had spent 6 weeks preparing. I had spent those same 6 weeks trying to keep the airstrip functional on reduced operations, while managing the financial reality of what a prolonged legal fight costs. My savings had taken a hit. The lesson revenue was still minimal. I had mortgaged about 8 months of financial stability against the outcome of a single hearing. I drove to the county administrative building alone. Paul was already there when I arrived, standing in the hallway outside the hearing room with 2 banker's boxes and a paralegal I had not met before. He shook my hand and said, "Today it ends." The hearing room was smaller than I expected, not a courtroom, but a formal administrative space with a raised platform for the hearing officer, a long table for each side, and seating for maybe 40 observers. Colt's team had 3 attorneys. The HOA had sent their legal representative and 2 board members. Colt sat at the table in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. The hearing officer was a woman named Margaret Holloway. She had a reputation, Paul told me, for running tight proceedings and having very little patience for arguments that were not grounded in documented evidence. That suited me fine. The proceeding opened with Colt's lead attorney presenting their case. He was polished, the kind of attorney who has done this hundreds of times and knows how to make a weak argument sound reasonable through sheer structural confidence. He walked through the venue's complaint history, the noise ordinance citations, the HOA restriction motion, the alleged safety incidents. He entered a noise study into evidence. The one the original attorney letter had implied was forthcoming. It had been conducted over 2 weekends by a firm I would never heard of, using measurement equipment positioned at the property line during flight operations. Paul leaned over and wrote 1 word on his notepad: methodology. The HOA's representative followed with a brief presentation supporting the restriction motion. He cited community welfare, quality of life, the HOA's mandate to maintain neighborhood standards. He was careful to avoid the complaint domain issue entirely. They clearly knew it was a problem and had decided to pretend it did not exist. Then Paul stood up. He opened with the land records, not as background, as foundation. He entered the original deed for my property into evidence, establishing the airstrip's existence predating every structure on the adjacent parcel by decades. He entered the FAA registration. He entered the full permit history, every renewal, every inspection, every county approval going back to the original construction. He walked Margaret Holloway through the timeline with the methodical patience of someone who had done this before and knew that administrative hearing officers respond to documentation, not drama. Margaret Holloway made notes throughout. She asked 2 clarifying questions about the permit renewal process. Paul answered both without hesitation. Then he entered the pre-application meeting summary. He read the relevant section aloud for the record, the same 3 lines I had read at the community meeting. Applicant acknowledges existing private airstrip operations. Applicant has reviewed FAA registration and county permit records. Applicant accepts proximity conditions as part of development scope. One of Colt's attorneys started writing rapidly. Colt himself stared at the table. Paul entered the investor presentation next. The aerial photograph. The caption. He displayed it on the room's projection screen and left it there for longer than was strictly necessary, long enough for everyone in the room to read it twice. Margaret Holloway looked at the screen. Then she looked at Colt's table. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The witness testimony came next. A former county planning official testified that the airstrip had been a documented and acknowledged feature of the area for the entirety of his tenure, which spanned over 2 decades. He testified that the venue's development application had been reviewed with full knowledge of adjacent flight operations, and that no objections had been raised by the applicant during the approval process. 2 longtime residents testified, Gerald was one of them, that they had lived beside the airstrip for years without incident and had never filed noise complaints. Both testified that they had been aware of the airstrip's operations as a normal feature of the area since before the venue existed. A certified FAA safety inspector testified about regulatory compliance. He reviewed my flight logs and permit records and testified that all documented operations fell within applicable federal guidelines. He specifically addressed the alleged low-altitude safety incident, the report that had circulated in the community, and stated that no incident had been reported to the FAA, and that the flight log records for the dates in question showed no operations inconsistent with standard practice. Colt's attorneys cross-examined each witness. They did not land anything significant. The former planning official held firm on every point. Gerald was unshakable. He had been watching planes land for 30 years, and he said so plainly and without apology. The FAA inspector responded to technical challenges with technical precision that Colt's team clearly had not prepared for adequately. Then Paul introduced the emails. He had requested internal communications from the venue's ownership group through the discovery process. Colt's attorneys had fought the request for 6 weeks. When the hearing officer ordered compliance, they had produced the documents under protest. There were 43 emails in the set that Paul considered relevant. He entered all 43 into evidence and then focused on 7. The first was dated 4 months before the venue opened. It was between Colt and his operations director. The subject line was Airstrip Strategy. The email outlined a plan to use OA relationships to generate regulatory pressure against the adjacent airstrip once the venue was established. It referenced specific board members by name. It used the phrase complaint volume as a metric to be managed. The room was very quiet. The second email was between Colt and one of the HOA board members, sent 3 weeks before the first official warning letter arrived in my mailbox. It discussed the noise ordinance citations that would be used and referenced the board members' agreement to push the restriction motion when the time came. The third email was internal to the venue ownership group. It described the airstrip as the primary liability to eliminate in year 1, and outlined a timeline for escalation: HOA pressure first, then legal threats, then community narrative, then insurance inquiry. They had mapped it out, step by step, in writing, before they ever opened their doors. Paul read key passages from each email into the record without editorializing. He did not need to editorialize. The language spoke for itself. Colt's lead attorney requested a brief recess. Margaret Holloway denied it. Colt took the stand for his own testimony. He had clearly been coached extensively. His answers were careful, hedged, full of qualifications. He acknowledged the emails existed, but offered explanations for each one. The airstrip strategy email was a contingency plan, not an active campaign. The communication with the HOA board member was a general discussion, not coordination. The liability to eliminate language was hyperbole in a private communication. Paul cross-examined him for 40 minutes. He walked Colt through the timeline, the pre-application acknowledgement, the marketing materials, the complaint campaign, the emails, and asked him to explain each one in sequence. Colt's explanations became harder to sustain as the sequence built. By the midpoint of the cross-examination, he was contradicting things he had said 20 minutes earlier. Paul did not raise his voice once. He just kept asking the next question. At one point, Margaret Holloway interrupted the cross-examination herself. She looked at Colt and asked him directly, not as a formal question, but as a statement looking for a response, whether it was accurate that his development group had formally accepted the airstrip's proximity conditions during the county approval process. Colt said that was accurate, but that actual operational impact had exceeded what they anticipated. She asked him whether those anticipated impacts had been represented in their investor materials as a positive feature of the property. He paused for a long moment. He said, "The marketing approach evolved." Margaret Holloway wrote something on her notepad and did not respond. The HOA's representative gave a closing statement that was noticeably shorter than his opening. He had clearly recalibrated what was salvageable. Colt's lead attorney gave a closing that leaned heavily on the noise study and largely abandoned the safety arguments. He was good enough to recognize which ground had been lost. Paul's closing was 8 minutes long. He summarized the documented timeline, the evidence of prior knowledge, the manufactured complaint campaign, and the fundamental question at the center of the hearing, whether a party that had formally accepted proximity conditions during a regulatory approval process could subsequently use manufactured community pressure to eliminate the condition they had accepted. He answered his own question with the pre-application document, the marketing materials, and the emails, laid end to end. Margaret Holloway took a 20-minute recess before returning with her decision. When she came back, she read from prepared notes. The Airstrip held full legal operating rights under existing FAA registration and county permit authority. The proposed operational restrictions were rejected in their entirety. The HOA's authority over flight operations was ruled outside their jurisdictional scope. The noise study was found methodologically insufficient to establish actionable nuisance under applicable statute. She added one unrequested comment at the end. She said the evidence presented raised serious questions about the good faith basis of the complaint campaign and recommended that the county attorney's office review the internal communications for potential regulatory violations. She closed her folder, and that was it. I sat at the table for a moment after the room started moving around me. Paul was shaking hands with his paralegal. Colt's attorneys were packing up quickly, heads down. Colt himself walked out without looking at anyone. I stood up and walked out into the hallway. Paul found me a few minutes later. He did not say anything immediately. We stood there in the corridor of a county administrative building on a Thursday morning in February, and after a moment he said, "It is done." I nodded. I did not feel what I thought I would feel. Not triumph. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than either of those things, the particular feeling of having held a line for long enough that the pressure finally stopped. I walked out to the parking lot and stood beside my truck for a moment. Then I drove home. I got home from the hearing around noon. The house was quiet. I changed out of my suit, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table for about 20 minutes doing nothing in particular. The documents were still spread across the counter from the night before, my copy of the permit history, the flight logs, the printed emails. I stacked them into a pile and set them on the shelf beside the door. I did not need them anymore. Then I went out to the hangar. The Cessna was where it always was. I had been keeping up with the maintenance throughout everything. That was one thing I had not let slip, no matter what else was happening. I ran a pre-flight check the way I always do, out of habit as much as anything. Checked the control surfaces, the fuel levels, the oil. Everything was where it was supposed to be. I did not fly that afternoon. I just wanted to be in the hangar, sit with it for a while. That evening, Paul called to walk me through the immediate next steps. The hearing decision was binding. Colt's attorneys had a narrow window to appeal on procedural grounds, but Paul did not think they would pursue it. The internal emails made any public appeal an exercise in extending their own embarrassment. The HAO restriction motion was dead. The county attorney's office had confirmed they were reviewing the internal communications as Margaret Holloway had recommended. Paul said, "It is over. They are not coming back from this." I told him I appreciated everything he had done. He said, "Buy the hangar a coat of paint. That is all I ask." I scheduled the first post-hearing flight for the following morning. Early, wheels up just before sunrise. I had been running a limited night operation for the past several months, flying in the pre-dawn window when complaint triggers were harder to manufacture and the regulatory pressure had less traction. It was never something I loved. Night flying requires a different kind of focus, a different relationship with the instruments, and doing it out of necessity, rather than choice, had made it feel like a concession, even when it was a strategy. That first morning flight changed the feeling of everything. I taxied out in the dark, ran through my checks, and pushed the throttle forward. By the time I lifted off, the sky had started turning at the eastern edge, that particular shade of dark blue that exists for about 4 minutes before actual sunrise. I climbed to pattern altitude and made one circuit of the field. The venue was dark and still below me. Empty parking lot. Pavilion closed up. Just a building sitting on a piece of land, the same as any other building. I landed, taxied back, and sat in the cockpit for a moment. The night flights were done. Word traveled faster than I expected. Paul had sent a formal notice to the HOA board and to Colt's legal team the same afternoon as the hearing. By the following week, the community group posts had gone quiet, the Safe Skies Coalition page stopped updating and eventually disappeared. The local paper ran a brief item about the hearing outcome. It was 4 paragraphs. Factual, no editorial position. Enough. Students started coming back within 2 weeks. Carla called first. She said she would heard what happened and wanted to pick up where she would left off. I told her to come out Saturday morning. She was there at 7:30 with her logbook and a thermos of coffee, same as always. We ran through a session and she flew well better than before, actually, like the break had given her time to process what she would already learned. 2 other former students called within the same week. A new inquiry came in from a young man who had seen the paper's coverage and wanted to know about beginner lessons. By the end of the month I had a fuller schedule than I would had before any of this started. Local pilots drifted back. A man named Howard who had been using the Strip for weekend flights for almost a decade showed up one Saturday with a 6-pack and a handshake. He said he had been following the situation and was glad it had gone the right way. We stood by the runway for an hour talking about nothing in particular, the kind of conversation that feels like something being restored. The HOA fallout took a few weeks to fully land. Barbara Tilson, the board member who had opposed the restriction motion and called me after the vote, was elected board chair at the next general meeting. 3 of the 4 members who had voted for the restrictions resigned before the election. One of them released a brief written statement saying he had acted in error and regretted his involvement. The member with the brother-in-law connected to Colt's development firm resigned without comment. The new board sent me a formal letter about a month after the hearing. It acknowledged that the complaint process had been misused, expressed the board's commitment to fair representation of all community members, and stated that the Airstrip's operations were recognized as a long-standing and legitimate feature of the area. Barbara had clearly written it or guided whoever did. I framed it. Not out of satisfaction exactly, more as a record of what was possible when a process corrected itself. Colt's venue kept operating. That is worth saying plainly, I never wanted it closed. I had no interest in his business failing. I just needed my Airstrip to survive. As far as I could tell, he stayed out of the community conversation entirely after the hearing. The venue's social media went quiet on the aircraft subject. Event bookings apparently continued. The location was still beautiful regardless of everything that had happened. The county attorney's review of the internal communications was ongoing as of the last update Paul gave me. Whether it produced formal consequences I could not say with certainty. That was not in my hands. What was in my hands was the runway. I started a repair project I would been deferring for 2 years, resurfacing a section of the Strip that had developed some weather cracking. Hired 2 guys from town, worked alongside them for a week. Physical work, methodical, satisfying in the way that outdoor repair work tends to be. By the end of the week the surface was clean and even and looked the way a runway is supposed to look. My daughter drove up the weekend after the resurfacing was finished. She walked the length of the Strip with me the way she used to when she was young. One of those habits that returns without being planned. At the far end we stopped and looked back toward the hangar. She said, "Grandpa would have enjoyed watching all of this play out." I thought about that for a moment. My father had been a quiet man about most things, but not about the land. He had a particular feeling about this property that went beyond ownership, something closer to stewardship. He did not think of the Airstrip as something he had built so much as something he had been given responsibility for. He used to say that land remembers who took care of it. I do not know if that is literally true. But standing at the end of that freshly resurfaced runway with my daughter beside me, I understood what he meant by it. This fight had never really been about noise complaints, or HOA ordinances, or legal jurisdiction over flight operations. Those were the instruments of the campaign, not the thing itself. The thing itself was whether 40 years of a family's investment in a piece of ground could be quietly erased by people who arrived last and decided their convenience mattered more than everything that came before them. It could not. Not because the legal system is perfect, it is not. Not because good faith always wins, it does not. But because we had documentation and patience, and an attorney who understood that the only way through something like this is straight through it, and because we did not blink. I walked back to the hangar as the light was going. My daughter went inside to start dinner. I stood in the hangar doorway for a moment, looking out at the runway in the late afternoon. A single-engine Piper was making its approach from the north, one of the local pilots who had started coming back. I watched it settle onto the Strip, heard the tires chirp on the fresh surface, watched it roll out clean. Just a plane landing on a runway, the way it had always been. About 6 weeks after the hearing, I organized a fly-in. Nothing formal. I put the word out through the Regional Pilot Network Open Field Day at Mercer Strip. Bring whatever you are flying, families welcome. I did not expect much. A Saturday morning event at a small private airstrip in a rural county is not exactly a major draw. 14 aircraft showed up. They came in through the morning singles, a couple of light twins, one beautifully maintained Stearman biplane that drew a crowd the moment it touched down. People brought lawn chairs and coolers. Kids pressed up against the rope line, watching every approach. Someone brought a portable grill. By 10 of the clock, the field had more people on it than it had seen in years. I spent most of the morning just moving through the crowd, talking to pilots I had not seen in a while, answering questions from kids who wanted to know how fast, how high, whether I would ever been scared. A teenage girl asked me how long it took to get a pilot's license. I told her and watched her do the math in her head. I gave 2 young people my card. At some point, Gerald found me near the hangar and handed me a cup of coffee. We stood there watching a Cessna on final approach and did not say much. We did not need to. Some things are complete without commentary. Later in the afternoon, after most of the aircraft had departed and the crowd had thinned, I went into the hangar alone. There is a photograph on the back wall, has been there since before I can remember. Black and white, slightly faded at the edges. My father is standing beside the runway, maybe 30 years old, squinting into the sun. Behind him the strip is rough and unpaved, the earliest version of what it eventually became. He is not posing exactly. More like he just stopped moving for a moment and someone caught him there. I looked at that photograph for a while. He gave most of his adult life to this piece of ground. So did his father before him. They did not do it because it was profitable or because it made them well known. They did it because they believed that building something lasting was its own reason. That some things are worth maintaining simply because they exist and they are yours and they matter. I had almost lost it. There were nights during those months when I sat in this hangar and genuinely did not know if I had enough left to keep going. The financial pressure was real. The isolation was real. Watching something you love get systematically attacked and misrepresented, that wears on you in ways that are hard to describe to someone who has not experienced it. But the runway was still there. The planes were still flying. And for the first time in a long while, the future felt clear again. If this story made you think about what you would have done, whether you would have fought back or found a way to compromise, I would genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments below. And if you have dealt with something similar, or know someone who has, share this. These stories matter because property rights do not defend themselves. Someone always has to stand in the gap. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. There are plenty more where this came from.